Imagine training 8 hours a day, getting punched in the face for a living, breaking bones, bleeding, sacrificing everything. And then your boss tells you, you're getting a pay cut. That's exactly what's happening in the UFC right now. Dana White just made the biggest mistake of his career, and the fallout? It's absolutely insane. Top-ranked fighters are walking away. Contracts are being torn up, and the entire future of mixed martial arts is hanging in the balance. Let me paint you a picture of where we are right now. The UFC is worth over $12 billion. Let that sink in for a second. $12 billion. Dana White, the president and face of the UFC, has become one of the most powerful people in sports. He's rubbed shoulders with presidents, celebrities, and billionaires. The UFC has evolved from a fringe sport that was once banned in many states to a global powerhouse that sells out stadiums worldwide. But here's the thing that nobody talks about enough. While the UFC's value has skyrocketed, fighter pay has remained. Well, let's just say controversial. In boxing, fighters typically get 70 to 80% of the revenue. In the NBA, it's about 50%. In the NFL, around 48%. But in the UFC, fighters reportedly get somewhere between 16 to 20% of total revenue. That's insane when you think about it. These are the people putting their bodies, their health, and sometimes their lives on the line every single time they step into that octagon. And now, things are about to get even worse. So here's what went down, and this is where things get really interesting. Multiple sources inside the UFC have reported that Dana White and the UFC brass recently called meetings with several top-ranked fighters. Not just any fighters, we're talking about main card athletes, people who've headlined pay-per-view events, fighters who've built their names and risked everything for this company. And what did they tell them? They wanted to restructure their contracts. Translation: pay cuts. Big ones. Now, you might be thinking, wait, how can they just cut someone's salary? Well, here's where the UFC's contract system gets really complicated. Unlike most major sports leagues where there are players' unions and collective bargaining agreements, UFC fighters are considered independent contractors. This means the UFC has way more flexibility in how they structure deals. But this isn't just about cutting the pay of struggling fighters or people at the bottom of the roster. According to insiders, they approached fighters who were making anywhere from $200,000 to $500,000 per fight and told them they needed to take significant reductions. Why? The official line is budget restructuring and sustainable business practices. But fighters aren't buying it, not for a second. One fighter, who asked to remain anonymous, told reporters, "They're making more money than ever. We're selling out arenas. Pay-per-view numbers are through the roof, and they want us to take less?" It's insulting. This is where the story takes a dramatic turn. Instead of just accepting the cuts or quietly negotiating, several high-profile fighters did something unprecedented. They said no. Not just no, but we're done with it. At least 5 ranked fighters, including 2 who were in title contention, have reportedly told the UFC they're prepared to walk away if these pay cuts go through. One fighter even showed up to a scheduled meeting and literally walked out when they started discussing numbers. Think about what that means for a second. These are athletes who've dedicated their entire lives to this sport. They've sacrificed relationships, endured countless injuries, and fought tooth and nail to get to the top of the most competitive fighting organization in the world. And they're willing to walk away from it all. The question everyone's asking is, why now? Why is this happening when the UFC seems more successful than ever? Here's what you need to understand. Fighter pay has been a simmering issue for years. Fighters have complained, fans have protested, and there have been multiple lawsuits. But nothing really changed because at the end of the day, the UFC held all the cards. They had the platform, the biggest stage, and fighters felt like they had no choice but to take what was offered. But something's shifted. Social media has given fighters direct access to fans. Platforms like boxing and other fighting promotions are offering competitive deals, And most importantly, fighters are starting to realize their collective power. One top 10 ranked fighter posted on social media, "I've been knocked out, I've broken bones, I've bled for this company. I've made them millions, and this is how they treat us? I didn't get into fighting to get rich, but I also didn't get into it to be disrespected." That post got over 2 million likes in 24 hours. Now, Dana White is not someone who backs down from a fight, whether it's inside or outside the cage. His response to all of this has been, well, exactly what you'd expect from Dana White. In a recent press conference, when asked about the fighter complaints, Dana said, "Listen, nobody's forcing anyone to fight for the UFC. If they don't like it, there are other organizations out there. We've always paid fighters what they're worth based on what they bring to the table." He continued, "These guys need to understand this is a business. We have costs, we have overhead, we have obligations. We can't just throw money at everyone. The fighters who perform, who sell tickets, who sell pay-per-views, they get paid. It's that simple." But is it really that simple? Let's look at some numbers. The UFC reportedly brought in over $1.3 billion in revenue last year. That's billion with a B. They have deals with ESPN worth hundreds of millions. International broadcasting rights are through the roof. Sponsorship deals are at an all-time high. Meanwhile, the average UFC fighter makes around $150,000 per year. And that's before taxes, before training costs, before medical expenses that aren't covered, before paying coaches and nutritionists and everyone else on their team. A fighter making $150,000 might clear $70,000 after everything is said and done. And remember, they might only fight 2 or 3 times a year. One bad injury and they're making nothing. Dana's argument has always been that the top fighters make millions. And that's true. Conor McGregor, Israel Adesanya, John Jones, these guys make serious money. But they're the exception, not the rule. For every Conor McGregor making $20 million, there are 50 fighters struggling to pay their bills. Here's what makes this situation so explosive. It's not just about money. It's about what the money represents. These fighters feel undervalued. They feel like they're treated as replaceable parts in a machine rather than the actual stars of the show. And when you try to cut the pay of people who are already feeling undervalued, you're basically pouring gasoline on a fire. Think about it from a fighter's perspective. You train 6 to 8 hours a day. You follow a strict diet. You can't party with friends. You can't eat what you want. You take damage to your brain and body that might affect you for the rest of your life. Your family worries every time you fight that you might not come home the same person. And then someone who makes millions sitting cage side tells you that you need to take a pay cut so the company can maintain its profit margins. That's a tough pill to swallow, but there's another layer to the story that's really important. The UFC has always maintained tight control over its fighters through exclusive contracts. When you sign with the UFC, you typically can't fight for anyone else. You're locked in. This means if you walk away, you're essentially walking away from your career. That's why these fighters saying, "We're done with it," is such a big deal. They're calling the UFC's bluff. They're saying, "We'd rather not fight at all than continue under these conditions." And if enough fighters take that stance, the UFC has a serious problem. The fighting world is absolutely buzzing about this situation, and reactions have been all over the map. Other fighting organizations are watching this very closely. Bellator, One Championship, PFL. They're all seeing an opportunity. If top UFC fighters become available, these promotions could make serious moves to sign them. We've already seen rumors that several fighters have been contacted by rival promotions offering competitive deals. Imagine if someone like a top contender jumps ship to Bellator or One Championship. That immediately legitimizes that promotion and weakens the UFC's monopoly on top talent. Fans are divided too. Some are firmly on the fighters' side, arguing that they deserve better pay for the entertainment they provide. Others point out that fighting is a choice, and if someone doesn't like the terms, they shouldn't sign the contract. But here's an interesting perspective from a former champion who spoke on a podcast recently. "When I was fighting, I was scared to speak up about pay because I thought they'd just replace me. Now I'm retired and I can say the truth. We were all underpaid, and we all knew it, and we all stayed quiet because we wanted to keep fighting. If these fighters are finally standing up, I support them 100%. Sports analysts are calling this a watershed moment for MMA. Some compare it to when NFL players went on strike, or when NBA players threatened to boycott. Those actions led to major improvements in player conditions. Could we be seeing the same thing happen in the UFC? Now, we can't talk about this situation without addressing the legal implications because there's some really interesting stuff happening in the courts. The UFC has been involved in several antitrust lawsuits over the years. Fighters have alleged that the UFC's business practices constitute a monopoly that suppresses fighter pay. While these cases have had mixed results, they've shown a light on how the UFC operates. The current situation could actually strengthen these legal arguments. If the UFC is trying to cut fighter pay while simultaneously increasing revenue, that could be seen as evidence of monopolistic behavior. Legal experts suggest that if this dispute becomes public enough, it might encourage more fighters to join existing lawsuits or file new ones. There's also the question of contract law. Can the UFC actually force pay cuts on fighters with existing contracts? In most cases, probably not without the fighter agreeing to it. But the UFC could potentially choose not to offer new fights to those fighters, effectively freezing them out. That's where the independent contractor status gets really murky. If fighters are truly independent contractors, they should have the freedom to fight elsewhere. But UFC contracts typically include exclusivity clauses. So are they employees or contractors? That's a legal question that courts have been grappling with for years. One thing's for sure, lawyers on both sides are probably working overtime right now. If you're a fight fan, you're probably wondering, what does this mean for me? In the short term, it could mean some events get disrupted. If fighters refuse to compete, cards might get canceled or significantly altered. That would be disappointing for fans who've bought tickets or planned watch parties around big fights. But in the long term, this could actually be good for the sport and for fans. Here's why. If fighter pay increases, it incentivizes more elite athletes to choose MMA over other sports. Right now, an incredible athlete might choose football or basketball because the guaranteed money is better. If the UFC paid more competitively, we could see an even higher level of talent in the octagon. Better paid fighters also means fighters who can afford better training, better nutrition, and better medical care. That leads to better performances and more exciting fights. Plus, when fighters aren't desperately fighting for every dollar, they can be more selective about their matchups. This could lead to more meaningful fights and better storylines, rather than fighters taking any fight offered just to make rent. There's also a fairness aspect. As fans, don't we want to know that the athletes we're supporting are being treated well? It's hard to enjoy a fight when you know the person in the cage is struggling financially despite being one of the best in the world at what they do. To really understand this situation, we need to look at the history of fighter pay in the UFC. When the UFC started in 1993, it was basically a Wild West show. Fighters got a few $1,000s and there were almost no rules. As the sport evolved and became more mainstream, pay increased, but it never kept pace with the company's growth. In the early 2000s, fighters like Tito Ortiz and Chuck Liddell started pushing back on pay. They had some success because they were huge stars, and the UFC needed them. But most fighters didn't have that leverage. When the UFC was sold to WME-IMG in 2016 for over $4 billion, many fighters hoped that would lead to better compensation. Instead, many reported that things actually got tighter as the new owners focused on maximizing profitability. There have been multiple attempts to organize fighters over the years. The Mixed Martial Arts Fighters Association tried to gain traction. Several prominent fighters have spoken out. But until now, there hasn't been a unified moment where multiple fighters simultaneously said enough. What makes this current situation different is timing. Social media gives fighters a platform. Alternative promotions provide options. And there's a growing public awareness that maybe athletes in violent sports deserve better protection and compensation. What do you think? Should UFC fighters be paid more? Is Dana White right to maintain strict control over costs? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this breakdown helpful, smash that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the world of combat sports.